I'm going to open with a poem that is called The Astronomer. Adamant in his argument against winter, he plots the distance to the horizon by graphing the shape of a tree against its green, calculating the sum of the wind when yesterday is taken from it. His azimuth splendor maps the city twice in time, and he feels the drag of the tide pulling him along through millennia into other cities, each of which existed here in this same place. Afternoon, in sunlight, he climbs up the mountain and arrives at the flower gate leading to the garden on the slope, there being no more resistant surface upon which eternity could make its useless claim, that the prayers he learned all his life mean no more to him. Thrust up from the dark of the earth only to wither, how are flowers in any way supposed to understand God? They are no better than a human body that seeds and sprouts and dies. And even if a body were to remake itself or rename itself as different matter, what would it matter? Briefly, he wonders, is he a river furiously plotting a course, or the boat floating down it, or the person inside? No mathematics can plot the path from a body that doesn't exist to a city that doesn't exist. The storm won't abate, its numbers irrational, its tempers extreme, like that of another poet mathematician who lived 1,000 years back, or maybe one who lived 1,000 years on, drawing patterns in stone to cut for tiles, piecing together a map of the universe, 7 small planets, swinging their cosmography of charlatan destinies. Is that his future? Or is it history, unmapped? He remembers that the sage Ali warned the astrologers to cease telling fortunes, not on account of potential infidelity, but because the book of the stars was impossibly infinite, and so many bodies, yet unseen and uncharted, that any divination risked planetary imbalance. And so he never knew which of the unknown constellations truly governed his kismet. Fairy prince, lonely brother, angry son. At any rate, stubborn as a volunteer, he appears in the flower beds, and annually he clamors to be, along with the hyacinths, tulips, and orchids, gathered and carried to portal adornment. He broke his way through the glittering dome by guts and calculus, that science meant to plot the relationship between different objects unspeakable that move through the cosmos at varying speeds. In the kingdom of heaven, the belt of Orion is no belt at all, but stars separated by galaxies and light centuries. His hands on the bars of the garden gate grow dark in the dimming light, and suddenly he understands the horizon is not the end of the world, but like God and the unfound planets, it is only the end of his knowing about the world, like that call to prayer unspooling its rebuke over silver-leafed olives and cypresses on its way down to make an unresting vow to the blue devastation of the unbound sea. This next poem that I'll read to you is called Abu Nawaz, And Abu Nawaz was a 7th century poet. He was half Persian and half Arab. And his sobriquet, Abu Nawaz is not his real name, like people have these titles, and so his name means the father of locks, and by locks it meant like locks of hair, because apparently he had these long, curly locks. Halfway between the northern and southern sky hangs the constellation of Abu Nawaz, who drunk and in love knelt at places rivers split to refuse all paths and offer his mosaic prayer. Unhinged, he peeled from yellow-leafed birches enough paper to fashion a bark and make for the moon, floating in the moment where one wave becomes another, amber, driftwood, or beach glass, or lost, unmapped stars reciting, "We are what produces itself," sanded and cast adrift, precisely at the horizon, and so eternally unseen. One note emerges from the drizzle of sound, what finally, somehow, though endless, does wash ashore. And this is a poem that's called John. And I know the title is somewhat mysterious. I mean, John can be many things. It's like a slang for a bathroom. It's like a customer of a sex worker. It's one of the Gospels. It's also a street in Lower Manhattan on which I once lived for a brief season at the turn of the millennium. Who was I when I was writing this name? Copper oxidizes to green, air packs itself tight in the seed unspools in the ground, writing the biography of dirt. A little down the road, another tower is going up. A man holds his briefcase over his head like an umbrella. In the rain, bodies are soft and disappear into sound. On John Street, almost choking on loneliness and the waters of the river, nothing so much as the air around us, and ash, what would outlive us, drifts sparkling into the October air. When you ask, who am I past this storm-tossed vessel, the one you're always bailing out, it is just another way to ignore this constant unraveling, this always reaching for an end when clearly there is no end in sight. I would like to read to you, I'll save that one. I would like to read to you a poem called Drone, and so I'm flipping through my book to find that little poem. Here it is. And the drone, it kind of refers to the flying drones, and it also refers to, in Indian classical music, you will often hear a drone as part of the music in the background. Do strangers make you human? Science fiction visiting bodies as cold fact. What unknown numbers govern our genes or phones? A constant thrum from outer space. Snow makes a sound in sand. You are seen from far above. Will the myth explain you? Unheard and vanished. Bodies dismember to dirt. hardly alive, hardly a person anymore. Who will I be next? And in that life, will you know me? Yeah, okay, this is a poem I think I will actually, I may actually close with this poem because then we're going to have a little conversation. This is a poem that's called America the Beautiful. I open into a space of unknowing flickers, but frightened by the evidence and unwilling to release an old and instinctual clench in my gut. I open a new document and type Trump's America to see if that will make reality more real, help me to see into the future. But what if I recounted something ordinary instead? Some old story that had nothing to do with Gold Star mothers or my cousins and uncles forced to register because of their faith. Hyderabad is a southern city in India, though it doesn't feel like one on account of its Urdu heritage, and it is situated right on top of what used to be a mountain range 70 or 80 million years ago. To the east, the hills ruckle gently the subcontinent on their way to the Bay of Bengal, and to the south and west, the boulders break and shatter into parched plains. Beyond the lake called Hussain Sagar, in a house in Mushirabad, hometown of my mother's family, I have locked myself into a bedroom. My uncle has just spent the evening explaining to me that what I have is not a mental disease, actually, after all, but a spiritual one, because the devil has entered my heart and made me criminal. And that I let him is further proof of moral deficiency. My aunt hovers in the kitchen during the lecture, wringing her hands, hoping it all turns out for the best, and when he is finished, she brings me a glass of warm milk and almond meal flavored with saffron and rosewater. "Did you have a nice talk?" she asks, her voice trembling a little bit. They leave me there in the apartment, fashionably furnished in a modernist style, offering to deadbolt and padlock the door behind them for my safety, and though I refuse, I bolt myself into my bedroom anyhow and stay up all night. My uncle asked me how I, raised as a Muslim, could turn my back on a whole lifetime of teaching, while my cousin's wife, Elisha, raised in rural Wisconsin as a Christian, somehow found her way to Islam. And he kept telling me in our conversation that Elisha was a new Muslim because, unlike many in my own generation of our family, he points out, Elisha covers her hair and makes her daily prayers and found her way to follow. Unlike most converts I know, Elisha did not change her name. Why would she? The name means noble or truthful, depending on who you ask. And what is truth anyhow? Is the truth my body tells itself enough for me to know it, or must I be taught out of some book written in a language I never knew? All through the night, I fastened myself to lonely stars and the glowing screen in order to still the seismic shock of Hyderabad. My body was not the only one that was failing. That night, I saw a note from Elisha that my cousin Shabir, her husband, had been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. On the surface of Hussain Sagar, night birds scream. My body has never belonged in the world. God and I were secret lovers hiding in the closet from my friends and his. And when he put his tongue in my mouth, my body came alive as a beast, an animal, the wild creatures that roam the night of my imagination. It is true. I learned the religion of my parents not just by heart, but by rote, repeating verses, casting their vowels deep into my throat, pasting the consonants to the roof of my mouth. Arabic changed the muscles of my breath and made poetry possible. How then did my favorite imam become not Imam Kazim, for whom I was named, and at whose shrine 1,000 people died during Bush's war when the bridge they were on collapsed, but instead Imam Raza, the one who fled the Arab world, fled into Persia to save himself and his sister from the government that sought to write him down criminal and pull his body into the earth. He made for India, but delayed overlong in the mountains of Qum, where the snow casts its melody in ivory dust like the flutter of birds' wings against paper, or the surgeon's light tool flickering through Shuber's body. It's a trick that history outside has nothing to do with history inside. A trick that God's words believed by heathen others aren't also graven in fire in my own body. And though I tune out, the stiletto of the world spikes through. A young gay man in California has a bottle broken over his head. Hashtag Muslim bitch and hashtag Trump 2016 are spray painted on the side of a building. A cafeteria full of school children begin chanting, "Build the wall." We're here. It's now. A black man accused of selling cigarettes without a license is strangled and killed. A group of white men who staged an armed occupation of government property are acquitted and released without punishment. But stop. Those things happened before. So what has changed and what hasn't? In Hyderabad, on a hot summer night, the electric fan groaning overhead, I turned all the lights off and read in the dark the screen in front of me flickering with messages from Elisha. We held on to that tether all night long, though 10.5 hours apart. It was me who spent all night sleepless, talking with Elisha about illness, about recovery, about how bodies fail, about what prayer was really worth. And Elisha, who gave up work for the day to lie on the couch, laptop on her stomach, writing to me about God, who he loves, and how no one gets to choose that or explain it, about what faith does and doesn't mean, about who does their prayers and at what times during the day and what form do they take. Today, a long time after Hyderabad, a long time after I thought I would feel safe forever, and I did, until I didn't, I try to find an armature for grief, for loss, for the end of a certain kind of world. I crave no light tether now. My commented upon body in the library that could be a highway is published in wilderness, wanton, starving among the desert rocks, put upon, blogged about, pissing away the silence, while far out to sea, unnoticed, a new nameless tropical depression gathers around an eye. I remember one childhood summer when I was sent to stay with my boy cousins to learn my proper model, proper games, and amid those forms of hardness, I discarded the text in favor of the wind. humble to start a nation, a notion 1 galaxy wide with its bureau of infernal propagation. Wild plants to betray the soil, our surface now roils with the unreal, wind through wheel. Does not God want to win and flout the unspoken? At Hussein Sagar, a sand crab crawls the lake's skimpy rack line. Water meets earth in the form of the broken. Water is where fire and air enter among earth and water. A painting is the meeting of the eye and the touch. Mind this river out of reach but heard through the trees, felt on the skin. The river is sculpture, unfolding in time. Such a quick turn then, unmoving. My body so cruelly useless. And bodies now being beaten and killed. This emptiness now turned back. And what is this rage? I wanted to break everything in the house, but my body wouldn't dare. All these trees planted for future shade. That long ago summer, the only games I agreed to play involved brightness and bird calls. In Hyderabad, in the night, I reached across the wires to any friend, while outside loomed the dark rocks which broke apart millions of years ago and ended the reign of the dinosaurs on Earth. In the end, my uncle never brought up our conversation again, just tried to be friendly as if it had never happened. Shabar lived. And I started to see Elisha was like me, an outrider. She chose a new faith, but she kept her own first name. Her middle name she changed to Nasim, meaning morning breeze. And her last name is Rezvi now. It means from the family of Reza. Do you remember him? Reza, the imam who wandered. Thank you.
Very good.
Hi.
How you doing? You good?
I'm good. I'm sorry, that last poem's pretty long, but I just can't stop. You know?
I love that poem.
Oh, look,
That's
I have a message from Elisha.
There. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, okay.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. All right. So I have a few questions, and I know we're gonna open it up for Q&A. So if y'all are thinking about things, then of course we want to hear those too. But there's a piece in the last poem that sort of struck me, and that I think is a thread that sort of runs throughout the book. So in that particular poem, we see the speaker get like sent to the boy cousins to learn these particular models, right? And so I'm curious, right? Because I even think about the poem that's sort of like the origin story, right? And the way that the mother is sort of wrestling with silence, and how something about that feels gendered as well. So I guess my question is, for you, how is your sort of understanding of gender and the role that it plays in your work, and I guess just in your life, like how has that developed?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, I had a very, very specifically circumscribed experience with gender expression growing up, and there was definitely things that I was allowed to do or be, or ways that I could feel, because I wasn't allowed to be like too emotionally expressive. That's not considered to be, correct behavior. I couldn't like care about my appearance too much. There's like all kinds of things that were sort of, and I grew up as a boy with two sisters, and I grew up in a matriarchal family too, with the women kind of ran the joint a little bit, which I think is not, there are many different families that are like that. And so for me, there was always, I always had a concept of the feminine, or the like what was gendered as a feminine, to be powerful. But there was a lot of, I think, suppressed almost rage, I would say, among some of the women in my family in the older generation, because of all of the social constructs that we all grew up with. There were certain ways that we could express ourselves and certain ways that we couldn't. And for me, that was very much tied up with sexuality. So that was also kind of quite difficult. And we're talking about really like South Asian culture as a very homosocial culture. There's a lot of gendered separation, and so there's a lot of emotional intimacy between, and physical expression of that intimacy between people of the same gender, which does not necessarily track in any way with sexuality or queerness. Right. It doesn't mean the culture is any more queer friendly. In fact, maybe precisely the opposite. Yeah.
So does that queerness then complicate that sort of homosocial space?
Yeah, for me, it definitely did. I mean, I definitely, I'm a slow learner, and I published my first book, I was 34 already, so I was also a late start, I was not writing and publishing when I was in my early 20s. And I kind of wish that I had been, because, I think that the days of the expression that's available in poetry now is like, this is not as much of a block for younger people, and there are people who are in their 20s and very early in their 20s who are publishing widely, and they're very well known for all of that kind of work. I was organizing. I was a political science major in college, and I became an organizer, and I worked in Albany, New York for a couple of years, and then I was in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, and it wasn't until I was 27 or 28 that I actually began writing. But I think it's not necessarily because I was just drawn away from that other pathway. I do think it's because I myself was not really able to confront all of these things. And so in my first book, which I didn't publish until I was 34 years old, I still wasn't really engaging a lot with gender or sexuality. Or my second book, really. It was really the third book that I published in 2009. So how old was I in 2009? You can do the math, but closer to 40 than 20, let's just say. A lot closer to 50 than 20. It wasn't until that book, it was called Bright Felon, that I actually kind of took on sexuality and gender head on. Yeah. So this stuff is very deep, and it's very challenging for a writer to face, and I think we all find our subjects when we ourselves are ready for them. Because I think if I had tried earlier, I don't think I would have been able to do anything. Yeah. It just took its time showing up.
I'm really curious. You said you were organizing. What was the nature of that work?
I organized for public higher education. So in New York, there was, and still is sort of, but there was a grand public system called SUNY, and then CUNY is the system in New York City. And they were both not open access, but they were tuition free. And CUNY was open access for a long time, but all of that's changed. Okay. So open access means anyone can go. Right. If you have a high school diploma, you can go. Right. Yeah, that's the true democracy of a public education system.
Sure. Yeah. And do you, I guess, well, see, now I have sort of a different question. I guess at some point there was presumably some sort of transition where like that organizing ceases to be the center of the work and the artistic work sort of rises. But I guess I'm curious, like, what do you carry from that space into your current work?
It never did separate for me. I always, as a writer, always engage with those matters. And it may be more obvious in some poems and less obvious in others, but it's certainly always on my mind. And I do think there are times when, as a writer, I feel that I want to use, to write about things that truly need my attention. So at the moment, I grew up, I didn't talk about this in the pieces that I read you today, but there is stuff about it in this book. But I grew up in the far north of Manitoba in Canada. My dad was an hydroelectric engineer on one of the dam projects. And all of those northern dams, they provide hydroelectric power to the entire nation of Canada, but they also do sell power to cities in the United States. So cities in northern Wisconsin, cities in North Dakota, the city of Minneapolis, they all buy power from this dam that my dad helped to build. And like many of the other dams in the north of Canada, they're all built on what's called treaty land in Canada, which means it's unceded land. It's not precisely the reserve or reservation. They say reserve is the term they use in Canada. It's not precisely the reserve land where the First Nations people live, but it is on their treaty land. So the province had to make a agreement with the nation, it was called Pimchikamak, in order to build this dam. And they built it 40 years ago. And in that time, all of the environmental mitigation promises that were made and the economic and social development promises that were made have not been fulfilled. And so the community up there is in crisis. It's around 8,000 Indigenous people on the reservation. And that's where I grew up. That was my childhood. And so I was writing this poem about, I have no hometown. My hometown is not on any maps because I grew up in a company town, which was trailers in a forest. And so I was doing research for a book called Silver Road, in which I wanted to write about my old hometown that disappeared. And lo and behold, all of this info came up. And I hadn't looked back once in 40 years to think about what the hell was actually going on, So that's when I knew I had to go back. So I went back last year and I spent some time there and I interviewed a bunch of people and wandered around in the forest, and the elders, as soon as I showed up, all the elders wanted to take me around and show me stuff. And because that was a company town of 500 or 600 people, the workers and their families. And in all that time, in the 40 years since we left the forest in 1979, not one single person from the town had showed up in Cross Lake, which was the Indian reservation. Nobody, not one of the workers. All the people I went to school with, we all grew up there together. So that's like when you are, Mahmoud Darwish always said, he was a great Palestinian poet, and he lived in Beirut at the same time as Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who is a Pakistani poet. And they were comrades politically as well. They were both communists and communist activists. And they would always argue about what's the role of the poet in the revolution, quote unquote, And Faiz was a revolutionary poet. He felt like the poet has to use his art in service of humanity, basically. And Darwish didn't believe that at all. He said the poet has no role as a citizen. He is an artist only. But it's not that he didn't write deeply political work, and that was very much considered to be part of Palestinian liberation movement, because he did, and it was. But it's the perspective that they brought to it. And I have that feeling too. I could go to Cross Lake just as a reporter and write journalistic articles, but I knew that I could do something else instead. And so I went as a poet and I wrote this book. It's prose. The book is prose. It's not poetry, but it's a memoir about going back and figuring out what happened. But it is a meditation on what home is and placedness, and where we can actually experience that looking back and where we can't.
What's the name of that book?
It's called Northern Light, and
Okay.
It's gonna be coming out from Milkweed, but I don't know when.
Okay.
Maybe next year. But you can go to the wilderness of northern Canada and meet and question placeness and where you belong and who lived here before and what happened to the land. But every square inch of the country, including where we're sitting right now, is unceded territory. It has its history, and we meaning America, as with a K, the great state has done its level best to erase all of that, as much as possible of all of that, and preserve the rest of it, freeze it in time. So you'll have the national park system, just to just freeze that. It can't ever turn into anything else. Like the Indian people who live up in northern Manitoba, they're not allowed to chop the trees because it's like the environmental preservation initiatives of preserving the trees, but they're their trees. You know what I mean? So it's difficult. It's so it's been a trip.
Absurd.
But does that answer your question about like being a writer in politics?
Yeah.
It's not like you don't separate them.
Sure.
They're sort of, and different people interpret it in very different ways.
Yeah.
And every way of interpreting it is okay. But if you absolutely think that your work has nothing to do with politics, then it's like you've chosen the wrong side, basically. Because no, seriously, like that's a complicity, basically.
Yeah. So I want to sort of turn to the other thing that came up in that answer, in thinking about place, right? So you have this memoir that is sort of specifically thinking about that, right? But it comes through in the poems in like various ways, like the poem John, the origin story piece that you sort of talked about, and even these poems are like constantly sort of filled with like landmarks and even like pieces of the topography, pieces of the landscape. So for you, like how are you thinking about negotiating place in the work, and how is that sort of connected to how you think about negotiating it in the world, right? Because I think sort of this question of like where we're from, where we live is like, and who sort of owns that is like very sticky in some ways.
Well, there's a guy named Joshua Keating. I think that's his name. He just wrote a book about this. It's really interesting. His book is about countries that don't exist. So he's written about Kurdistan, he's written about Palestine, he's written about places where there are people or Khalistan, which is like the Sikh homeland in India, that there's no borders on the map. And so he talks about three distinctions: the country, the nation, and the state. And the country is like a recognized area, a recognized territory. It could be historical. It could be it's the physical place. It's the physical land. It may or may not have borders, or it could have borders that are like widely agreed upon. For example, like when you say England, people know what that is, but the country is just the space that's there. The nation, to say nation means you have a shared set of political or cultural aspirations or agreements about what that means. Like, what does it mean to say you're American? What does it mean to say you're Indian? It's not just geographical in his concept. It's country is geography, and nation is like this, we believe in freedom, or we believe in whatever it is that we believe in. That's the nation. The state is the political entity that controls. And the definition by, I forget this theorist, Brazilian theorist, if there's a smarty pants in the room, you'll tell me who it is. But there is a theorist who defined the state as the body that has a monopoly on the use of force. Yeah. So the American state they have the monopoly on the use of force. If you punched me now, that's a crime. But if a police officer, he's allowed to, under certain circumstances, or whenever he feels like it too. TBH.
Listen.
Yeah.
Listen.
So that's really interesting to me. So it's like when we, as Americans, the nation is like, what is the American nation anymore? It's disappearing. It's like we have all different kinds of ideas, the people who live in this geographic space. The trouble is there is one state. So do you see what I mean? Yeah. So there's all different layers, like where are we now? We're in the city of Chicago, we're in the state of Illinois, we're in the United States, we're on such and such unceded indigenous land. I don't know the name of the place we're in right now. So nobody knows where you are in time or space. That's why I'm obsessed in my writing to try to always figure that out. Yeah. And then the other part of this is who is the person? Who is the body? Who are you? What does it mean to be Nate as an American or as a black person or as a man, like, and all of the, you know, we don't want to say intersections because it means the separate threads that are crossing, but like the whole entity of who you are and who I am and what the space is between us and how we're governed and how our relationship is governed by all of the external rules too, you know? I don't know. It's like the kind of thing that I think about too much, probably.
No, that's great. So I want to sort of open it up. I have more questions, but if there are other folks in the room that have.
I do have microphones here if anybody.
Yeah, there's microphones. Got one right here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for those poems. There was one beautiful line, I probably won't get it exactly right, but about Arabic changing the muscles of your breath.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I was wondering how the multiple languages you may have had contact with, or even speak, I don't know which you speak, you may have influenced your writing, and if you've ever written in another language.
For sure they have. I grew up in a polyglot household in India, my early childhood, before I learned how to write. But when I was a baby and starting to speak, it was in that household. And in southern India, it's pretty common for people to speak multiple languages, 3 or 4 even. And it doesn't map against education. I mean, because people just learn these languages as they grow. So you'll speak Hindi, or if you're Muslim, you might also speak Urdu, or Tamil, or Telugu. So my grandmother, who was not educated, she went, I think, up to 5th grade in school, but she spoke 7 languages and was literate in all of them, so she could read them as well as write them. And it was just like, I mean, I think that is a little unusual, but not super unusual, you know? And then we moved to the States when we moved to Canada when I was about 2 years old, and then that's when I started to speak English, and I forgot all the other 4. I apparently, according to my parents, I spoke 4 different languages, but in a mishmash. So I didn't really speak the language. I was just using words from 4 different languages. That was my initial experience with language as a child. And so English is sort of my 5th language, but it's the only original one that I have. And so I wondered a little bit about how syntax works. And, you know, Noam Chomsky, in his linguistic work, said that the all language syntaxes are patterns in the brain and of meaning making. And so, you know, Chinese syntax and Greek syntax, they're all just other ways, they're other pathways in our brain. And there was some example that was given of a Chinese man in China who had some kind of accident and hit his head, and when he came out of the coma, he could still speak Chinese words, but he was using syntax from some other language, so it sounded like a jumble, you know? Something about that is really attractive to me. Something about the ecstasy of expression and like unmooring from the buckles of English syntax and kind of moving out into space. And so I explore that a lot in my poetry. I like, I don't think I read too wild of things to you today, but certainly there are moments where the syntax gets non-normative, I guess you would say. But I really love that idea. And to me, language is like dance. I mean, it just moves all over the place. And it's true with Arabic, the consonants, they don't exist in English, right? I mean, we have 24 or 26 or however many we have letters and sounds that we make, and then all the in-between sounds with our mouth. But in Arabic, there are even more than that. And there are many different vowels too that go down into the throat. That's really wild. And so, yeah, it's just the music of the language is so powerful and beautiful, you know. I always love it on Star Trek when the Klingons sing, you know, the Klingon opera. It's just so great. There's nothing else like it.
That's great. Other questions? Thoughts? Anything? No. Oh, you done me in the back? Hold on. Got a microphone.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, there seemed to be a tension in the last poem you read between like spirituality and what that makes possible, and the body and what that makes possible. And that's something that I think comes up in a lot of your poems. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
My road to the spirit is long and complicated, but ultimately it is breath, it is the shapeless. The body is the shape, and the breath is what the shapeless part. I thought about that in the poem Abu Nawaz that I read at the beginning, what somehow though endless does wash ashore. And I thought about the ocean or the sky as expressions of a divine, the human as a shape the divine takes, which maybe means that it's a shard of or broken off from. It's a Sufi idea, but it's also present in Vedic philosophy as well as Kabbalah and other most mystical traditions across religions. Many, I should say, maybe not most, many mystical traditions across religions involve a notion of the individual as an actual part of the divine. So you don't have the dualistic, separated concept of Christianity or Islam, where the individual has to be redeemed for something. In Christianity, it's quite transactional, actually. There's like things that you can do to redeem yourself. And in Islam, it's a little more, it's transactional in a different way. It's long-term, repeated practice. I think Christianity, you just have to, accept Jesus, and you might be good to go. So I think about that, and in Judaism and Islam, it's like the similar dualist concept, but the practices are ongoing. You just have to keep doing all this stuff over and over and over again every day of your life, sometimes 5 times a day. And I tend more towards a non-dualist idea that we are the same. There's an ancient Indian text called the Shiva Samhita, and in it, there's one part that's talking about humans, and it says, as the sun reflected in 100 cups of water is actually the same sun, so too is the immortal spirit reflected in all of you. And I just love that. I think that's as close as I could get to what I believe about God.
That's beautiful. Wow.
I didn't write that.
Yeah. I mean, but you brought it to us. So
someone did. Someone wrote it at some point in
That's
700 AD or whenever that text
fair.
was written. Yeah.
Well, shout out to that person. Truly. Maybe like one or two last questions, if there are any.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you, everybody. Oh,
Oh,
no?
Thank
no.
you. Oh, there is one more question.
There.
Going, gone.
There you
There it is.
This is probably a question you could ask to a lot of people, but you obviously have a lot of pride in who you are and where you come from, and then there's also, I don't know, for the lack of a better word, maybe trauma with some experiences, for example, with your uncle. So I was just wondering how you think about that and how you balance that.
I think if I thought about it too much, it would paralyze me a little bit. So I've just moved forward. There was a time I did think a lot about it and worry a lot about it and wish that things could be different. But I think it was just age. I think at a certain point I just realized I better live my best life. And so that's what I've done. There are people who've fallen out along the way that I wish I could have back in my life, but I don't know what to say, RuPaul says what other people think about you is none of your business.
Listen.
So I guess, that's all I have, That's really all I have.
Very good. Okay, we got one more. All right.
So Kazim, I was just wondering about some of the stuff you were mentioning about your family and just how family factors into your work, and I guess that's kind of linked to the the trauma idea, or can be, and just how, I guess you understand your experience in your family, and like reconciling like space from that, and does the work sort of serve as a way of making sense of your relationship to where you came from?
Yeah, I mean, we did okay for a while, my family and I. And then we had a rocky period, and we're trying to figure things out, you know. I still see my parents. I still go back and visit them, and I don't share I send all my stuff every time I publish a book. I send it there. I don't know. We don't talk about it ever. They tell other people I'm a writer, and they tell about me, and my nephew takes my books to his school teachers, and when they're teaching poetry in the 6th grade class or something, he'll take a book in and say, oh, my uncle's a poet. But we do a lot. I mean, we're South Asian, so we do a lot of avoidance technique, you know. You just leave things out, or don't ask, don't tell is like a pretty tried and true strategy. But ultimately, you know, we only have each other for a short amount of time. So we just got to figure out, like, if going home to see my parents was like truly killing me, I would have to stop. But I think if I stopped, it would kill me. So I've just got to try wherever they're at is where we're just going to be, you know? No one's happy about it, but we're mortal. We're small things, you know? And we die quickly, actually. Some of us quicker than others, especially in my family. People die young, so not to be depressing, but so yeah, you know, I just have to do that and make it work. But I promised myself I would never not write about something. There have been a couple of poems that I chose never to publish, and one I read out, actually. I've read it out twice, and both times I read it out, I asked the audience, like, not to quote it or say anything about it, and they were recording the reading, and I asked the videographer to cut it out of edit it out, because I just didn't want to share it. It was a poem about my father. So we're allowed to do that. And you're allowed to write about it and put it away and not show it either. It's for you before it's for anybody else, the writing.
Kazim, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Give a hand. So, and thank you to, you know, the Humanities Festival, Gallery Gashard.